All right, so this is the Static Site Editor product and design focused weekly call. It is Monday, June 29th here in the US, and for Michael, it is Tuesday. And let's kick it off. We didn't have any high-level FYI, so I just wanted to talk about two things on the agenda. We'll start with the issue that Enrique left a very in-depth comment about. To summarize the problem, Toast UI in its conversion between Markdown and HTML in order to render it is making maybe slightly over-aggressive changes to the syntax and actually incorrectly parsing, in my opinion, some of the more advanced Markdown, which is still technically standard Markdown, like maybe slightly extended Markdown, but I think it's still part of the spec about using footnotes and tildes instead of dashes for code blocks, things like that, where it seems to be falling down a little bit. So he's outlined two problems, the first being like incorrect rendering, and the second being formatting convention. So like if you write a list with bullets and then you switch and you publish and you come back to it, it'll reparse it, if I'm understanding correctly, using dashes based on the default for the Toast UI Markdown conversion. Not ideal, as he calls out in the issue. It's great if this is if you make the project and you're only using the static site editor, you would never know. But for the handbook, it's very problematic because we're going to end up with people's work getting reformatted, even if we can fix the formatting that's actually in error. The stylistic considerations would result in potentially a lot of MRs or a lot of lines of code changed in MRs that don't need to be changed, and potentially drive some people a little bit bonkers with the choices that we make about how to style things. People get rightly very particular about the way they write Markdown. So I don't know that I've come to my own opinion on the answer right here. I think we can just talk about it openly. I don't know if we have an easy solution here, but my gut, when I heard about the issue last week, or not heard about it, but when I realized how big the issue was going to be last week, my gut was just like, at least for now, if we could just replace the Markdown conversion or the Markdown converter in Toast UI with a fork that we then just like I know it's a lot of hand waving, this is significant work, but we override that to use our handbook style guidelines and adhere to those. There will still be a problem with anything that doesn't follow those guidelines. So if somebody's using bullets and we convert it to dashes because that's the Markdown style guide for the handbook, and then they switch back, we will still have the same issue, but at least we'll be consistent. And if handbook pages are written consistently, then Toast UI shouldn't be too noisy. Long term, I think he's getting at this in the comment. And again, sorry, I haven't read in depth, but long term, this would be something that I would expect we'd want to expose in a config file or some kind of customization, allowing users to maybe write their own Markdown rules and provide it to our editor, or plug in a different Markdown parser altogether. Those kinds of things, though, are not part of our immediate scope. So I think we need a way forward sooner than later. I don't know. Thoughts?
I haven't read it in full detail, but like from the gist that you're saying, yeah, applying your own custom rules seems like the right thing to do. It kind of follows that kind of rules around linters and stuff like that, where you can customize the rules and things. But yes, in the short term, since this blocks the like swap, would this block the kind of swapping between the rich text and the like markdown view, or do you see us changing or like preventing one of these things from happening so that we don't need to deal with this? Or
if we can overcome the aggressiveness in which it reformats things, I don't think it would block toggling between modes.
Yeah.
But there was actually an external user. There's a better word for that in our handbook. I know a member of the community outside the GitLab team that left a comment on this issue, and they were very excited about the static site editor, but found it to be a blocker for them using the tool, the WYSIWYG editor in particular, because of the way it broke their footnotes. So if we can fix that, but we can't fix the aggressive reformatting as you switch between them, we might have to disable the markdown mode until we have a resolution, but that seems also problematic because that's the only way we're exposing editing front matter or anything that's not purely markdown. It really would limit the usefulness of the tool. So yeah, it's an interesting trade-off.
So if we allow different, like if we allow preservation of the markdown, that also implies that we have some sort of configuration that says what specific flavors of markdown they're using. And since there is a wide variety of those, it's potentially like, how do you want to handle bullets? How do you want to handle code blocks and these various levers? Or else we could start by just saying, here's a couple of flavors that we support, but it seems like to make a majority of the people happy, we're going to have to make it really configurable if we go down that route.
Yeah, I agree. And we don't want to have to, like, the whole point is making this easy for people to use, but we also need to remember that we're always assuming there would be a front-end engineer doing the configuring. It was not meant to be easy to, I should say, easy is not the right adjective. It was not meant to be like a one-click setup or anything, or like a non-technical setup wizard. If it necessitates us like creating a config file that then they have to define 8 or 10 different rules, and there's like appropriate values that we document for each one of those options, and they just have to pick one. That's, I think, acceptable. It's not ideal. I think my feeling right now is that we would just continue to support Markdown, but similarly in our handbook, how we define our Markdown writing style, those would be the types of things we would call out as customization. Like you said, bullet style, like whether pull quotes get the caret on every line or just the first line. And honestly, I think for the near-term iterations, we wouldn't expose that at all. These are just things that I guess I would propose that we just override the Markdown parser to follow our guidelines, because our target is the handbook right now, and then work towards like defining those rules in a config file over the coming months.
So I could imagine a pie in the sky or lovable or big hairy audacious goal, whatever the right word is, where people could just say, here's a couple of examples of my Markdown, and here's a couple of examples of the HTML that it generates, and we could sort of reverse engineer and spit out a config file that would be maybe most usable for them.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic. The other thing we should look into, and I haven't looked too much into the proposed UX for this, but I know the Web IDE team's working on simplifying the GitLab CI YAML like creation and giving real-time feedback as that very complex file is being, or in my opinion, very complex files being configured. And it's the beginning of a strategy to enhance what the Web IDE can do. If we could just direct people to something like that and then use their work and have those rules feed into, like, you're creating a static site editor, config file, and we use the Web IDE as a vector for creating that file and use the work they're doing. It doesn't actually have to be a tool. Like, we don't have to define that in our tool, and if someone else is doing something that's making this easier for people, we could probably piggyback on their solution. But that, I don't know. I know they're working on it actively. I don't know when they expect to extend it beyond the GitLab CI file. And yes, I agree though, pie in the sky, long term, 18 months from now, we could absolutely see, like, feed me your project, and we could either detect based on, like, oh, we know you're using Cramdown, like, we know about that one. But if we don't recognize it, we say, like, okay, well, give us an output and your source file, and we'll try and match them up and get sort of implicit preferences, and then let them, like, override it if we get it wrong. That'd be kind of fun. Well, I need to give this issue and this comment in the issue a lot more thought and a thorough response. But that's kind of my take on skimming it over dinner. And obviously, it's probably one of the bigger decisions we'll have to make this month. So I want to give it due time. If we have any concern, I guess the question that's maybe unspoken is whether we have concerns about Toast UI being something we want to invest that much time into, and what the implications would be for changing course this soon. On one hand, we have very few active users. It'd be fairly minimal disruption to change the editor, but we've I don't want to sunk cost fallacy this, but we have invested some time in getting it up and running, and it works somewhat. So if there's another approach we can take to handling handbook content in the Toast UI editor, I'm open.
Cool. I guess the other one that I have in mind is, like, potentially just not allowing the toggle, and then it forces us to handle front matter, force us to handle, like, editing of mermaid diagrams directly in the Toast UI editor as is. Because those are things we were going to do, or, like, we currently have, like, planned in the future milestones, so that, like, if you did want to edit the raw markdown, then we have a link to, like, the classic single page editor. Is like, okay, if you want to deal with that stuff, it does make things a lot messier with, like, commits and branches, and whether you're still in the same branch or a different branch, and that stuff. But that's probably, like, another way because, like you said, we're not there. It was like we don't have many users yet using it, and we're still, like, fleshing out the experience. So I think we just keep Toast UI now until we find a better solution. But this is something that could potentially force the decision sooner than later.
Yeah. And that's a good point. And I've mentioned this before, but I think just to reiterate, I think my take is that our long-term goal would be to disable that source code editor in here anyway. Like I'm not really interested in building a split screen source code editor. I think that's what the Web IDE could be for, or the single file editor. But I want to make the WYSIWYG editor as powerful as we can make it so that you don't have to use anything like that. So yeah, editing front matter, you know, pasting code snippets into code blocks that then aren't actual like rendered as code blocks, but you could like set what language or something like that. You know, there's a lot of things we'll have to solve for. I will say that made me think that I wonder, I believe we've talked about this before, but I wonder if there's an opportunity to try and target only the changed lines instead of parsing the whole file. Like I mean, you're gonna have to parse the whole file to render it in the WYSIWYG editor, but it's probably too much work to try and like only change the formatting of the area of like the blocks that are being edited. Because I think even if we hide the Markdown editor, if I'm reading this comment correctly, you load, for example, a very long handbook page, like the product page, it's gonna reformat everything as soon as you open the document in the WYSIWYG editor. And so that means all the bullets will get changed to the style, and all the code blocks will be formatted, and pull quotes will be formatted the way that Toast UI wants to format them, which will have a very large footprint, we'll say, in the merge request, and make the actual changes hard to parse, and potentially, you know, go against people's wishes on how they would prefer to style their Markdown.
But
so
I think that doing
yeah.
it partially is just papering over the problem, because as soon as they
Yeah.
do modify one of those, it makes their file inconsistent.
It
So
is, yeah. It's
like-
definitely papering over the problem. It's probably too much work to be a patch solution
And
too.
Jean made the comment in chat. He said we would likely have similar issues with other Markdown editors. Also,
Sure.
Toast UI has the architecture ability to overcome these issues, and we might consider contributing code upstream to enable what we need. And I kind of agree with that. Like, it's not necessarily the sunk cost fallacy. Like, we've invested some stuff in learning how to do this and understanding Toast UI, and it's just code. Like, if it's a platform that offers extensibility, or it's at least decoupled enough to let us have the possibility of doing this, it seems better to try to do that.
Yeah, and that's a good point. We're going to run into this no matter what, unless there's something out there that comes with a configuration, a configurable Markdown parser that's like already covers everything we need, which is unlikely, right? I think we probably would have come across that already. So maybe then that's the answer. We just need to build that and decide whether we contribute it back to the project or build it in a way that's only long-term. It would be great to contribute it back to the project. I will say that, but okay. Well, I don't want to spend our whole half hour on this one topic, but this is interesting, and I'll continue to think about it tonight and tomorrow. I'm sure the conversation will continue. Before we run out of time, I did just want to touch on something, Michael, we talked about. I think we talked about it, but I talked about it with Marcel, and we've talked about it on the team call, and it looks like it's likely to happen, but that's the handbook group, which is also the StaticSite editor group, taking formal ownership of the entire handbook, including the UX, instead of right now, which we just own the architecture, and we can, everybody can contribute. We can make changes. We have made changes to the UX, but we would be the DRI for the handbook. I think we're getting some support in conversations we've had with marketing about this. I think it makes a lot of sense for the handbook as a thing, for a clear owner that can focus on it. I think the two downsides that I see are, one, there are some gray areas in content, as we've discussed, like the direction pages and some things like that, where we will find pages that belong on one side or the other, in a sort of ad hoc manner. Like we can do an audit and we can prepare as much as we want, but there's going to be someone that comes across a page and says like, why didn't this inherit the new style? Or why did you change my page related to X? And it'll be because, you know, it's on the wrong side of whatever line we draw. Not a big deal, but it'll be something we'll have to come up with an answer for. And the other thing is it adds additional work on your plate, Michael. So being the designer for our group, you would inherit a new product to design for. I think we would try and keep the work, at least this quarter, fairly minimal and go for some low-hanging fruit on the UX. And I was talking with Jean about this, and I totally agree that if we can just find a few wins and a few tweaks rather than an entire overhaul, that can start to differentiate it. That way we can visualize those differences in the pages. We can force that conversation about the direction pages and about other pages that wouldn't be included in those improvements, and that should be. Then we can work maybe, you know, through the rest of the year on a more strategic goal for the handbook and optimizing the experience, maybe do some research, figure out the real pain points, and propose some more significant UX improvements. That would then be, you know, something we would want to present to and get feedback from the marketing team to make sure we're aligned in vision and they know what we're doing and we know what they're doing. But I think this will be a good direction for the handbook as a product, and I think we'll have a little more freedom.
Before time is up, on a third point, or I guess it's really a sub point of the first one, it's not necessarily just deciding who owns a piece of content. There's a lot of shared stuff, and it's determining the DRIs for those.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked with John and with Lauren today, and I think we're all on the same page. Doing more of the monorepo and trying to get everything into the monorepo buckets is going to force that issue, and it's going to make it, you know, in the data monorepo.yaml file, it's going to make explicit all of these giant list of files which are shared. And even before we get to that point, some blockers to say, hey, you can't have this on that part of the site because it's owned by this and they're going to be built differently. And on the larger goal, like maybe they're moving to a CMS and not even going to be in middleman. So
right.
There's a lot of shared stuff. And in the short term, I'm mostly concerned about approaching cleaning up in a way that doesn't introduce a lot of code debt. Like we could wholesale start copying stuff, but that also means we could like copy a bunch of stuff we don't even need or use if we're not deliberate about what we copy and maybe splitting it out, what still is truly shared.
Yeah,
So,
and I think that's an important point. And the shared assets or the shared code is a really great way to think about this, because I think what we would do as we would, you know, work on making a better user experience is we would come across, in the process of re-architecting everything, we'd come across what code, and we can be a lot more deliberate about this should be shared. And that's the kind of stuff we would then know that we need to involve the marketing team or the blog, you know, whoever shares that code with us, whoever it also impacts. That's an explicit way of knowing that this is something that should be communicated outside of our group as well. But if there's something that's like, oh, this can be applied just to the handbook and it's for the better, that it's just for the handbook, that's another decision we can make.
And the stories we have in the Epic are thinking along those lines. For example, we want to get everything into the monorepo buckets, and then that will let us stop having middleman at the top level be responsible for handling the assets and let each individual site have its own Webpack. It can build what it wants, the way it wants, not what it wants, maybe some of its own stuff, maybe some shared stuff. And so those are all stories in the Epic that they're going to be a lot of work, but they're planned out, and they're kind of going to be necessary to tear this stuff apart.
Yeah, I see this as I see this as an extension of the monorepo focus. Like this is something that we've been talking about for months. Like, oh, who owns this? Like, should we be doing this? But this is just saying, like, you know what? It just makes sense, and everybody seems to agree. I don't think this is gonna. We're not gonna get a lot of pushback on this. But I do want to go over a few minutes and let Michael chime in because I've been talking for the whole 30 minutes almost. How do you feel about this?
I'm fine. I brought it up with Marcel, my manager, last week. We discussed it briefly, and yeah, I'm fine with it. Like I said in the past, it's kind of like this overlap between what we're trying to do with a static site editor and how it applies to GitLab, because the handbook itself. So I think there's a strong overlap there. And one thing that I raised was like, will we end up designing pages like the remote culture page and stuff like that, where it's more marketing heavy? And from discussions, it feels like we'll know which pages will hit marketing, and marketing will have a strong input on that. And therefore that clean separation is there. And like what Chad said, like maybe these pages become their own like repos and stuff like that. So I think owning the experience of the handbook itself makes sense. And yeah, I think marketing will have their own direction that will say like, yeah, we're looking after these pages, whatever that might be. So yeah, I was more concerned about kind of like the turnaround times on marketing pages that like, it's like you and I, this whole group here wouldn't have any context on. And it's just like, we need this page now. It's like, no, there's already a team of designers on the marketing team, and they'll look at that. We're more looking, at the moment in my head, is like the handbook, the structure, how that editing experience works, and then everything else is like extra.
Yeah, I agree, and I think all of this is serving to make that more clear on the distinction between a marketing page and a handbook, and I think that'll benefit readers of the site too. I mean, our handbook is fantastic and it's a great source of knowledge, but it's a different voice than is required for marketing content, and it serves a different purpose. And if you hit a page that looks like a handbook page but is written in marketing copy, it might feel slightly off. And vice versa, if you hit a page that really could benefit from marketing and it's like written by a PM, it might not be as impactful. So anyway, my plan is to draft an MR tomorrow to formalize this in the handbook direction page. I'll ping the whole group as well as the relevant stakeholders for approval on that, but I don't expect any back and forth. And with that, I will stop the recording and say goodbye.